Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about something pretty deep. We're going to explore the hidden connections between your culture, who you are, and your spirituality. We're going to unpack how the very fabric of your life might be telling a much, much bigger story than you've ever realized. Okay, let's just jump right in with a pretty wild idea. What if the divine, what if God himself was already present in your heritage? In your people's oldest stories, long before any missionary ever showed up. What if we've been thinking about this all a little too narrowly? So, this brings me to a story about a missionary and his wife who spent 2 decades, 20 years, deep in the Amazon jungle. And in all that time, not one single person came to Christ. Now, most people would have packed it in, right? But he felt this undeniable call from God to just stay put. So one day, he's with the tribe and he's telling them the story of the Tower of Babel from the Bible. He's really getting into it, and then all of a sudden, the tribe's chief just yells, "Stop! You're telling the story wrong." Can you imagine his surprise? He's thinking, what do you mean wrong? It's right here in the book. And in this crazy turn of events, the chief and the tribe, people who had never even seen a Bible, they start telling the missionary couple their own ancient story. A story about a giant tower, people trying to build their way to the heavens, and then all their languages being scattered. It was the exact same story. The missionary was absolutely shocked, but the tribe, they were even more blown away. The chief just looks at him and says, "Wait a minute, you're telling me that our story is in your sacred book?" They were just floored. See, they already knew about a creator God. They just didn't know he had a son. The missionary thought he was bringing God to them, but he was starting to realize God was already there. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. Way back in ancient Hawaii, long before any outsiders arrived, the people worshipped a creator god they called Io. And get this, one of their prophets actually foretold that one day a people would come from the sea carrying a black box, and inside that box would be the story of their god. And, well, you can guess what happened. When the missionaries finally landed, they brought with them a Bible, kept safe from the long ocean journey inside a black box. So the main point here is that God was already there, woven into the fabric of these cultures. That's what we just covered. Now to dig deeper, we're going to look at why so many cultures can feel broken, then how we can reclaim our identity, the incredible power of forgiveness across generations, and finally, what it actually looks like to live as our true selves. All right, so if God is already present in our culture, why is it that so many of us feel like our heritage is, well, broken, or maybe not as good as someone else's? This is such an important question, so let's really get into it. Well, think about what happens when a powerful culture like the British shows up in a place like Fiji. All of a sudden, a new set of values gets pushed on everybody. English becomes the better language. The local skin color is suddenly seen as less beautiful. Some people were even called burnt toast. And people started to believe that to be acceptable, even to God, they had to dress like the British. We're talking coats and ties, in a sweltering tropical climate. But, this feeling of being less than, it doesn't just come from these big external forces. A lot of the time, it starts right in our own homes. The messages we get as kids about our worth, our actions, our identity, they have a huge impact on how we see God. I mean, think about it. How many of us grew up hearing, "Don't touch that, be careful, leave it alone," over and over and over? The message we start to absorb isn't just about keeping things safe. It's this subtle, deep-down belief that the objects, the rules, the stuff, it's all more important, more valuable than we are. And that don't touch way of thinking, we often project it right onto God. We end up seeing him as this grumpy old man with a big stick, just waiting for us to mess up. Our relationship with him becomes about laws and fear, all focused on the things we're not supposed to do, instead of what it could be, a relationship of grace, focused on who God actually created us to be. So let's build on that in our next section. Because if our view has been twisted, the answer isn't to just throw our culture away. It's about rediscovering the beauty and the identity that God wove into it from the very beginning. So, what even is culture when you really boil it down? It's so much more than just food and music. At its heart, culture is a habit. It's the unique way a group of people does things. It's their collective personality. And at its very best, culture is the character of God being expressed through a specific group of people in a specific time and place. A fantastic symbol of this comes from Fiji's traditional tapa cloth. Here's how it's made. They take thin bark from 7 different kinds of trees, lay all the strips together, and then they just pound them with force. They pound and pound until all those individual strips mash together, becoming one single strong piece of fabric. It's this powerful picture of individual lives being given up to create something beautiful for the whole community. But here's where it gets even cooler. Those intricate designs you see on the cloth, they weren't just for looks. They were a compass. The patterns told stories about the waves, the direction of the current, the location of the stars and the moon. They showed tools and weapons. For the ancient Fijians navigating the huge Pacific Ocean, creation itself was their map, and they recorded it right there on their cloth. And all of this points to a huge difference in worldview that shows up in our cultures. In a group-focused culture like Fiji's, the default setting is we think. Decisions are always made based on how they affect the entire community. When you cook, you're cooking for everybody. Your name represents your whole family line. And that is so different from a more individual culture, like in America, where the default is, I think, personal choice is king. And your name, well, it mostly just represents you. Okay, but this brings up a really tough question. What about the parts of our culture that aren't beautiful? You know, the parts that are actually dark and hurtful and painful. Can those things, even the most horrific parts of our history, be redeemed? Well, let's look at the story of a missionary named Thomas Baker in Fiji. The cultural context here is everything. At the time, cannibalism was practiced not because they were hungry, but because they believed you could gain the strength of a warrior you defeated. And there was this sacred, unbreakable rule. You never, ever touch a chief's head. Well, Baker was a friend of the chief, and one day he just absent-mindedly reached out and took a comb from the chief's hair. This was a massive insult, and it led to his death. And yet this horrible, tragic event became a turning point. His sacrifice actually led to the end of cannibalism in that entire region. But that's not where the story ends, not even close. Over the next 150 years, this incredible journey of forgiveness began to take shape. In 2003, leaders from Fiji tracked down Thomas Baker's descendants all over the world, in America, Australia, New Zealand, and they flew them all to Fiji. In a national ceremony, the Prime Minister led the people in asking for forgiveness, and they offered hundreds of whale's teeth, which is the highest cultural honor you can give, to the Baker family. And what happened next is just unbelievable. It rained for a solid week, something nobody had ever seen before, and the people felt like the land itself was being healed and restored. This huge, powerful journey from a culture's brokenness all the way to national redemption, it's not just for nations. It's actually a map for our own lives. It's a path to healing the wounds in our own stories so we can finally live authentically as the people we were made to be. But the real challenge, of course, is figuring out how to tell the difference. How do we know what parts of our culture to celebrate and what parts need to be held up to a higher standard of love and respect? Because let's be honest, not everything that gets passed down as tradition is good. For instance, in that same old Fijian culture, women were deeply devalued. They were often treated like property, not people. That was a serious cultural flaw, a distortion that was just excused as tradition. The redemption comes when we recognize a higher truth, that both men and women are created equally in God's image. And the action, then, is to actively work against that old lie and lift up the true value of women. This need for healing is also reflected in a really painful, personal story from someone who endured terrible abuse as a child. This abuse included being put inside a sack and tied to a tree for a whole night by family members who were also respected religious leaders. That mix of pain and spiritual confusion is just devastating. Years later, after going through a profound healing journey, this person wrote a letter of forgiveness to his grandparents. And for 5 years, there was just silence, nothing. Then, one Sunday, his grandmother, who was a preacher, stood up to give a sermon about forgiveness. And right there in front of her whole church, she pulled out that 5-year-old letter and read it out loud. You see, it was only through really understanding and experiencing an unconditional love that this kind of forgiveness was even possible. And that act unlocked a powerful healing that finally broke a generational cycle of pain. So here's what this all comes down to. Your culture, with all of its amazing beauty and all of its painful brokenness, it isn't an obstacle to God. It is the context. It's the unique stage that God has chosen to reveal himself and to tell his story through you. So the only question left for us is, are you listening?